The Miccosukee Tribe of Indians is a Native American tribe in the U.S. state of Florida that has federal recognition. It is one of 3 federally recognized Seminole organizations, along with the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma and the Seminole Tribe of Florida. They belong to the Southeast Woodlands indigenous population. The Miccosukee language, often called Miccosukee, is spoken by the Miccosukee in the Florida Seminole. A dialect of Hitchiti, a descendant of Hitchiti, and another word for Hitchiti have all been used to describe the language. A Hitchiti-speaking population based in the town of Miccosukee, a tribal settlement connected to the Creek Confederacy, was identified by the British as Miccosukee or Miccosukee by the late 18th century. The town covered parts of what is now northern Florida, southern Georgia, and Alabama. The Miccosukee had a period of rising migration to Spanish Florida in the 18th century as a result of pressure from European expansion into their homeland. During the 3 military confrontations between the United States and the Seminole people, known as the Seminole Wars, 1817 to 1858, the Miccosukee were forced to relocate. Many Seminoles were compelled to migrate to Indian Territory west of the Mississippi River during this time, creating the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. Seminoles in a group of 200 or less would remain in Florida. The central and southern regions of Florida were home to the majority of the descendants of those who stayed in the state. Many Miccosukee built settlements along the Tamiami Trail in the 1920s and 1930s. This route, which was finished in 1928 and connected Tampa and Miami, passed through the Everglades. In general, the so-called Trail Indians continued to follow more traditional customs. The Cow Creek Seminoles to the north, who began relocating on reservations at around the same time, were more interested in formalizing their relationship with the federal government than they were. The Florida Seminoles were designated to have their federal status terminated in 1953. In 1957, the Florida Seminole Tribe was formally recognized by the federal government. The Miccosukee became a distinct tribe and received federal status in 1962 as a result of political disagreements. Indians who are not associated with either tribe and reside in Florida are known as the Traditionals or Independents. Big Cypress Swamp is the primary residence of the Traditionals, with a range that ranged from the Appalachian Mountains to the Florida Keys for hunting, fishing, and trade trips. The Miccosukees were historically a people that roamed between what is now Georgia and northern Florida. Miccosukee-speaking communities had been established in the Everglades by the late 1700s. Multiple Indian groups, including elements of the Oconee, Hitchiti, Eufaula, and Apalachicola tribal towns in southern Georgia and northern Florida, came together to form the core group that became the Miccosukee Tribe in northern Florida, according to scholarship published in cooperation with tribal elders. By the early 18th century, several Miccosukee ancestors from various regions had settled in northern Florida because of ongoing invasion by European and then American immigrants. By the late 1830s, Miccosukee or other Hitchiti dialects were the most widely spoken indigenous language in Florida. Although Muskogee was the predominant language in the Creek Confederacy, Hitchiti had migrated to Florida with permanent residence and took over as the primary language. This was true even though Muskogee was frequently used as the lingua franca in modern-day Florida, Georgia, and Alabama whenever Native Americans interacted with white people. The Miccosukee were a component of Florida's emerging Seminole identity for a while in the 19th century. Through the process of ethnogenesis, this identity developed in Florida around the beginning of the 19th century. However, in addition to maintaining their sense of independence inside Florida, the Miccosukees and Seminoles also believed that they were completely distinct from the Creek Confederacy, which was still negotiating with Europeans and asserting its dominance over Alabama, Georgia, and northern Florida. At Picolata, the location of a Spanish fort approximately 13 miles west of St. Augustine in northeastern Florida in 1765, a group of Native Americans known as the Alachua, a Muskogee-speaking group headed by Cowkeeper, Ahia, and a forerunner of the present-day Florida Seminoles, rejected a meeting between the British and the Creeks. In a separate meeting, Cowkeeper and his group of Indians made their own deal with the British. The annual gathering of the Lower Creeks was first attended by a group expressly referred to be Seminoles in the spring of 1787. Since the Creeks did not represent the people of Florida, the Native Americans in Florida contested the Creek Confederacy's 1796 Treaty of Coloran, which stipulated that all creeks in Georgia and Florida would return fugitive slaves to their white American owners. The Creek National Council was refusing treaty annuities to the Florida tribes before 1812. After Andrew Jackson's invasion of Florida, the indigenous people of Florida were entirely separate from the Muskogee by 1818 at the latest. Eventually, in the 1820s, the Miccosukees sided with the Seminoles to protect their territory in Florida against invading European immigrants. The Miccosukees retained their own identity within the Florida tribes in spite of the necessity for such an unofficial partnership. The Miccosukee and Seminole Indians were frequently seen as one group by the U.S. government and white immigrants in Florida during this period in particular. After losing the Creek War in 1813 to 1814, around 2,000 Upper Creeks, often referred to as Red Sticks, were militant Muskogee-speaking Indians who joined the tribes in Florida. Following this migration in the early 1800s, there were perhaps 5,000 Indians in Florida who were officially recognized. Many Hitchiti-speaking Miccosukee people were forced farther south as a result of the Muskogee-speaking Indians' arrival in Florida. Native Americans who spoke Miccosukee had been permanently residing in the Everglades as early as 1827, and maybe before. In 1817, U.S. soldiers led by Andrew Jackson invaded Florida under the guise of revenge for Indian incursions against Georgian residents, despite the fact that East and West Florida were still ruled by Spain, 1783 to 1821. The actual motivations for the invasion were the hunt for escaped slaves and the recognition that Spain lacked the political and military might to defend Florida. These were the first battles of the First Seminole War, along with the American soldiers' 1816 demolition of Negro Fort on the Apalachicola River. After Florida became a U.S. territory in 1821, the American administration quickly stepped up its efforts to expel all of the state's Indian residents. Numerous treaties were made between the United States and different tribes of Florida Indians during this time. White settlers were pushing for additional land, and the government in Washington, D.C. wanted to help those who wanted to colonize the new area. Payne's Landing, 1833, and Moultrie Creek, 1823, were two treaties that sought to unite Florida's Native Americans into remote areas, initially in the state's center and then in its southwest and southeast. The U.S. military's presence in the negotiations, together with challenges with translation and comprehension, meant that, despite the appearance of several agreements between the Florida tribes and the U.S. government, these discussions were never balanced between the sides. Additionally, the groups of men that represented the Indians during treaty discussions did not represent all of the bands that were then residing in Florida. Therefore, there was never full representation of all Native Americans in the state. The United States moved many thousand Seminoles and hundreds of Black Seminoles, who lived in close proximity as allies, west to the Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, after the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The American relocation agents tried to locate the Florida Indians with land under the Creek administration, since the U.S. government still thought the Florida Seminoles belonged to the Creek Confederacy. In the end, the Florida Seminoles in Oklahoma were recognized by the federal government as the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma and were granted their own reservation. During the Second and Third Seminole Wars, those who stayed in Florida engaged in combat with American soldiers. Groups of Indians were sent to Indian Territory as a result of each of these confrontations. Following repeated abuses by white settlers in Florida, such as robbery, assault, and unauthorized access into Indian territories, the Indians of Florida reacted, sparking the Second Seminole War in 1835. The Second Seminole War is a mostly forgotten struggle that had a remarkable influence on the history of the Southeast United States, American military tactics, and the contemporary development of the U.S. Navy. It was one of the bloodiest, most costly, and longest conflicts between Native Americans and the U.S. military. The Florida Indians fought a guerrilla battle against a technologically and numerically superior adversary. Although the United States failed to completely remove Indians from Florida, the conflict resulted in many more indigenous people being killed or exiled. Perhaps 300 Native Americans were still living in Florida by 1842. Between 1835 and 1842, almost 4,000 were forcefully moved to Indian Territory. The ancestors of modern Miccosukees and Seminoles stayed in Florida thanks to the Miccosukee chief R.P. Uckeye, also known as Sam Jones, Abiaki, Abiaka, who led the tribe effectively during the Second Seminole War. He did this by concealing the tribe on tree islands, or hammocks, in the Big Cypress Swamp and the Everglades. A small group of Indians commanded by Billy Bowlegs, Holata Miko, assaulted American camps in 1855 after U.S. military soldiers repeatedly harassed them and destroyed their property, sparking the start of the Third Seminole War. Billy Bowlegs' band was forced to leave Oklahoma as a result of this dispute after agreeing to a financial settlement. In 1858, the only Indians still living in Florida were those who sought refuge in the southern marshes and swamps. Perhaps 200 of the Seminole and Miccosukee tribes' forefathers were still living in Florida by 1858. They managed to survive by relocating to central and southern Florida in order to exploit the Big Cypress and Everglades geography, which the rest of the United States was mainly unaware of. Because American military attention was diverted elsewhere during the 1860s, American Civil War, the United States let the Native Americans in Florida to live their lives as they saw appropriate. With the exception of the odd gathering for trade, the indigenous people of Florida resided in Big Cypress in the Everglades from the end of the Third Seminole War in 1858 until the 1920s, purposefully avoiding contact with white Floridians. Off until 1900, Native American communities tended to congregate in larger camps. But as Central and South Florida saw more development, they started to split off into smaller groupings. When the Tamiami Trail, US 41, was built in the late 1920s, the seclusion of camps in South Florida started to come to an end. In 1928, the Tamiami Trail's construction came to an end as a route between Tampa and Miami. As a result, Big Cypress and the Everglades saw an increase in traffic types. Florida banned alligator and fur-bearing animal hunts just before the trail was completed. Indians started moving to locations along the trail as a result of growing traffic in the area. Many drainage and canal projects across Florida that altered the water levels surrounding the tree islands, and dwindling prospects for financial security. Between 1928 and 1938, more than a dozen settlements, or camps, grew nearer to the trail. By providing airboat excursions of the Everglades, selling indigenous artwork and other goods and services to visitors from all over the state, Miccosukee Indians aimed to better their economic status. The Miccosukees who settled along the trail also came to be known as the Trail Indians, although many people still considered them to be Seminole Indians at the time. Beginning in the 1930s and 1940s, the Miccosukee and Seminole started to diverge because the former felt that the latter were more inclined to go on to officially recognized Indian reserves in Florida in order to integrate to the mainstream culture. A third group, referred to as independents or traditionals, who did not identify with either the Miccosukee or the Seminole tribes, were later included by the federal and state governments in their continued treatment of the Indians of Florida as a single people. A small number of Seminoles filed a claim for compensation for land stolen by the U.S. government with the Indian Claims Commission in 1950, which further polarized the tribes in Florida. Many Miccosukees said that they never made a formal peace with the United States and that they preferred land return to monetary reparations. The U.S. settlement of the claims with the Seminole Nation in Oklahoma and the Miccosukee and Seminole of Florida was ultimately completed in 1976. However, it took until 1990 to divide the shares among the tribes. The 1950s saw the height of Miccosukee Seminole divisions. In 1953, the federal government suggested ending the United States recognition of the Florida Seminoles as part of its termination of recognition program. In 1954, a Miccosukee delegation personally presented one of President Eisenhower's aides with the Buckskin Declaration, which was the Miccosukee answer. According to the proclamation, the only thing the Trail Indians requested from the U.S. government was the ability to continue living on the land as they had always done. After creating a corporate charter and constitution to establish a government, the Florida Reserve Indians were recognized by the federal government in 1957 and were subsequently renamed the Seminole Tribe of Florida